All right, it's 1 o'clock, so we are going to get started. First of all, welcome to the third webinar in the ARDRAW Cohort 4 webinar series. I think that most of you are familiar with the program, but just a very quick overview for those of you who aren't. The ARDRAW program funds PhD and master's students to promote independent research in the field of disability studies. And today we have with us 4 of our cohort 4 students who are going to be presenting on their research and on all the work that they have done over the past year. But before we get to that, I just want to introduce myself and the ARDRAW team. So my name is Erica Smitka, and I'm program coordinator for the ARDRAW Small Grant Program at PRI. And I work with our colleagues over at SSA, Laura King and Kristen Harper. So I will hand it over to Laura to introduce herself.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I would like to welcome everyone to our third day of cohort research presentations. I am really excited to hear from our students today. And my colleague Kristen Harper is with us. And I think we'll just go ahead and get started because we've got a big group today.
Thanks, Laura. So as Laura said, we have a big group. Here's the agenda that we will be working through. A couple of housekeeping items though before we get started. So this presentation will be recorded and posted on the ARDRAW website within a week of today's date. And all of our students' papers will also be posted on the website. So if you'd like to read more about the work that they've done, you can do so there. If you have a question, feel free to please type it into the chat, or you may just unmute yourself after each student presents. And I think that's it. So we'll get going. Our first presenter is Sarah Deming. Sarah is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at Washington State University. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to go to presenter mode. For some reason, it doesn't look like I'm going to share my screen and then I'll present. All right, does that look correct to everyone? No notes are shown? Okay. For some reason, I've done this like 100 times and it's still every time I get it set up just a little bit incorrectly. All right, so again, my name's Sarah Deming. I'm a PhD student at Washington State University. And I'm working on this project with Dr. Mariana Amarin, who unfortunately cannot be here today. It's our first week of classes and she is teaching in this slot. So I am going to go ahead and give you a little background on the topic. Well, I guess I should read my, so this is about how children constrain and motivate the labor force participation of mothers with disabilities. So this research is grounded in my broad area of research for my PhD program is the impact of children on women's paid work. So there's an extensive body of literature about how motherhood constrains women's paid work. Mothers earn less than non-mothers. They work fewer hours. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that the gender pay gap that we hear so much about is actually more of a motherhood gap, that childless women make about similar amounts of money to men. It's really the divergence along gender lines in earnings really happens when children enter the picture. We also know that these impacts are disproportionately larger for women who already have disadvantage in the labor market. So women, unmarried mothers experience a greater penalty than married mothers, lower levels of education, and also Black mothers compared to white mothers all experience greater pay gaps when they become parents. We also know that disability is associated overall with decreased rates of labor force participation and increased rates of poverty. There's also evidence that women with disabilities have this kind of double handicap. So they're already disadvantaged in the labor force as women, and then occupying the additional minority status of being a disabled woman, creates even greater barriers for women with disabilities. This research is really building upon my mentor, Dr. Amarin's research through the ARDRAW program a few years ago. She did quantitative analysis of the American Community Survey and the disability SSA, I always forget what that survey is called, the disability the beneficiary survey. And she found this, she had a couple interesting findings, which is that one of which was that mothers with a disability were actually more likely to be in the labor force than similar non-mothers with a disability. And when I read her paper, I was like, that's interesting, because that is so counter to, my research about motherhood being an axis of, cutting women's hours and having them be more likely to not be in the labor force. But then when she kind of dug in a little deeper, she found out that there's this divergence along the type of benefits women receive. So SSDI recipients were less likely to have a job, whereas SSI recipients were more likely to have a job. This, of course, is kind of dependent on the fact that in the labor force just means what you are looking for work or currently working, versus obviously having a job as if you're currently employed. And she also found that mothers with disabilities were more likely living in poverty than non-mothers. So I took kind of the reins of her project and decided that I wanted to kind of dig into this a little bit more and figure out, where is this discrepancy coming from? What's happening? What's unique about the experience of women with a disability who have children in their house? How do they differ from women who don't have children? So some of the things that I kind of wanted to know that couldn't find data on is how many disability beneficiaries are mothers, despite the pretty extensive data that we collect on disability beneficiaries. We actually there is not a question specifically asked about motherhood status or presence of children in the home. And then we really just don't quite understand what, that finding that women with children were more likely to be employed. What's going on about, what is that about? How is motherhood acting as a promoting labor force participation? And then in what ways does motherhood hinder labor force participation? So among the SSDI recipients, for instance, who were less likely to be working, why is that the case? And then I was just really curious about, we have these existing rehabilitation programs, but how are they tailored to, the unique needs of women with children? So the research approach I designed to kind of answer these questions is based on in-depth, semi-structured interviews. Of course, the COVID pandemic happened right as I was kind of designing this project, so I had to pivot a little bit. I ended up doing interviews over telephone or Zoom, whichever participants preferred. And I used kind of a targeted but non-probability sampling approach. This is a convenient sample. I hung flyers locally in my area, which is 2 universities in North Idaho and Eastern Washington. But I got a few participants that way, but unfortunately all of the physical locations were closed at that time. There weren't, disability action centers and things like that. We're all kind of doing everything virtually. So I really recruited most of my participants via some disability related Facebook groups just across the country that I searched for, and that, friends who knew, were members of certain Facebook groups would share this flyer. And then I also posted some ads in the gig section of Craigslist pages. So in Los Angeles, Atlanta, I just kind of spanned geographically New York and got some respondents that way. I had everyone directed to a screening form on Google that kind of just took some basic information, and then I made contact once I kind of got the basic information from the volunteers. In all, I had 32 current and former recipients that had children under 19 years of age. I offered $40 for the interviews. The longest was 90 minutes. They averaged just about an hour. And then I transcribed those interviews, uploaded them to Qualitative software, and really engaged in an inductive data analysis process. This is a really exploratory study. There wasn't existing theory on this. I really just read the transcripts and just kind of coded at a very base level the first time, reread, just kind of kept coding, kept breaking down big groups of themes into smaller themes. And let's see. So the research questions that I settled on were really very broad. Like I said, this is an exploratory study. I really just wanted to kind of figure out what their experience was, what these, what role children play. So how children shape the labor market behaviors of mothers with disabilities. So I'm starting with kind of decisions about pursuing work, and then all the way into like actually locating, securing work, and maintaining work. Also, how do these programs that work or that are already offered, like, are they working for the mothers? Do they know about them? Are there gaps in what they need versus what is offered, and what types of support. I just asked women at the end, like, how could the Social Security Administration support your kind of unique situation? What are you missing? And that was so kind of guided all of the interviews. They kind of told me their story of their disability, and we talked about the kind of the role. One of the questions that I think got at a lot of these research questions the most was, how would your experience be different if you didn't have children? I'll get into that when I go into the findings. So that was kind of the broad theme of these interviews. So these are the kind of the descriptive statistics. About half were current SSDI recipients, 5 were receiving SSI, a couple were receiving a combination. So if your SSDI benefit is so low that it doesn't get you above the threshold of SSI, then you could occasionally be recipients of both. So 60% of the sample is household income less than $25,000. They have a decent mix of race and ethnicities, although still majority white. And yeah, I guess I know 18 of them found heard about it through the Craigslist ad, 6 saw the flyer in a Facebook group, the remaining 8 had seen the flyer locally hung on community boards. So what I found as I started conducting interviews is that what seems to happen is that disability influence, or motherhood influences the lived experience of women with disabilities in ways that then in turn influence their labor market decisions and behaviors. There were 3 themes that kind of emerged just about the ways that, these challenges that mothers with disabilities uniquely face. So the first one is this insufficiency of the benefit amount for supporting a family. This is just pretty much every woman I talk to, mentioned the fact that they are, supporting this number of kids, that like children, raise all kinds of additional expenses, especially during the COVID pandemic when everyone was home. When I was conducting these interviews, a lot of women talked about they eat all day long or their feet grow and they need shoes, like the children really create this additional expense, which comes as no surprise to any parent out there. Almost half of my sample, 14, were living exclusively on their benefit amount. They didn't have a partner with income. They had no other source of income. So for these women, it was particularly dire, this kind of insufficiency of income. 3 of my participants had experienced homelessness at various times, a lot of housing insecurity. So really this overall theme is how are women with a disability who have children different than those who don't? The number one thing that came up is just that they have greater expenses associated with children. So that benefit amount just does not go as far for them. So this is an example of Claudia. She was a college student studying business when she was assaulted, and her work history was really limited as a college student. So her SSDI benefit was then supplemented, by SSI. So she talked about how before having kids, she was living on $750 a month. And she said, back then I was getting about $750. That was managing me okay. I could pay my bills, still have a little bit left over. I was okay. But I was just taking care of me on that. So later in our conversation, when I said, what do you wish the Social Security Administration understood about your circumstances? And this is what she said. I just wish they could imagine trying to live off of $7.99 a month. If they could just imagine that, then that really says it all right there. Trying to raise a child. This person is highly dependent upon me for everything, and I have $799 a month to make it happen. Anything for myself is completely out of the window. So the second theme is this idea of, the disability is really a job for a lot of these women. It takes, they talked a lot just about the minutes of the day that it takes them to, for instance, change a catheter or get their shoes on, or, depending on the severity or depending on the type of their disability. Women with severe migraines who were had to stay in bed for days or a week at a time while they were battling their migraines. So that takes, the disability itself takes time. And now they're balancing the caring for children within the limits of their disability. And again, this is, 16 of my 32 mothers had no partner in the home. So they're the sole provider of care for these children. So that's just another way that mothers, with disabilities are different than other individuals who have disabilities and don't have caretaking responsibilities. So that was just part of the lived experience. And finally, a really overall theme was this idea of just adding, that children really added this sense of responsibility. They have increased fear of benefit loss, especially medical insurance. Those kind of went hand in hand a lot of times in the conversations. And then also just this idea of how to be a good mom, and that I will, do whatever it takes to support my children, that this really becomes the kind of galvanizing force behind their decision making. So obviously this is then going to translate into how they make decisions about the labor market. One quote that I have not on the slide, but Claudia, one of the women I spoke to, she says, if I go back to work, I lose my insurance. I might get insurance through a job, but I might not. It's a really, really scary process to think of. I couldn't take care of my child if I can't function. That's the most important thing to me, is taking care of the girl. So again, these are just these overarching themes differentiating mothers from non-mothers receiving disability. One woman, Deja, talks about, at one point, she's saying she lost benefits for 2 months because of a bureaucratic error. And I was like, well, what did you do during that time? And she basically says, like, is this going to the Social Security Administration? Is this report going? I was like, well, not, it's going to be, everything's anonymous. I'm not going to, she's like, well, never mind. No, I'm not going to say this one thing. When she's recalling how she supported herself during that time, she says, but I made it through that. I was cut off for 2 months with a child. Oh my God. But I survived though. Like I said, I'm not going to reveal it. Nope. I'm not going to talk too much, but I did survive. Moms do what they have to do. And that was a theme that came up a lot of times, is just the illegal things. In fact, one woman said, I feel like the Social Security Administration is making us do illegal things. You can't live on this amount as a single mom with kids. Like, people talked about selling drugs, prostitution, and, talked about other, kind of subtly hinted at other things that they did to make ends meet. So as far as the first research, this kind of brings me to the research question, is how do children shape the labor market behaviors of mothers? What I found is that there's kind of these 4 axes that these decisions varied across. So it seems like, at first, the kind of overarching thing is the severity of their disability. Obviously, for some women, they're just, the disability precluded them from working. They were in the category I kind of called not working, not looking for work, unlikely to work again. So of course, for these women, disability is the kind of the one and only thing that they're thinking about as they're deciding whether to pursue paid work. Also household resources, how much they need to work. If they have other sources of income, of course, that's going to influence that. It's going to influence, what their need is. So these kind of variation in costs and opportunities. But it gets down, and then we start thinking about the labor market prospects. So if they need to work, if they feel like they're not surviving on the benefit, then a lot of the things that they talked about were what education level they have, what types of jobs they could actually get, and whether it would be worth the risk of losing this benefit. And where motherhood really entered the picture was kind of at this 4th level of when, if they had a disability that would allow them to work, if they, were kind of motivated because of a lack of income, and they maybe had some labor market prospects, they had education, they had some training, they had labor market experience, perhaps, then they're getting to the point where they're having to also consider the fact that they have children, especially obviously people with younger children, and then what kind of support would be available for them as they pursued work. And that became kind of the limiting factor. So this idea of childcare as a barrier to securing employment really was salient for those women who kind of checked the other boxes. They were, potentially capable of some type of work, but they're, limited by school schedules. This mom talks about like, who wants to hire somebody who can work, from, work from 8 a.m. to 2:15-ish p.m. There was very few women that used formal childcare. They often were relying on family members and neighbors, things like that. And there's a lot of research showing that those informal care networks are much more precarious and subject to, changes. And so a lot of times that lack of care would end up causing women to lose their work. And then of course, we're talking during COVID. So at this point in the COVID pandemic, children were all home from school. So there was a couple women who had just started kind of thinking about transitioning off, looking for work, and now they are home with kids and precluded from working because of COVID. I'm going to skip a few here because I'm going long. So another barrier was this fear of benefit loss. And I thought this was an interesting, Tasha is a single Black mom. She's on SSI. For depression, she was on it the entire life of her now 19 and 17-year-old children, but she talked a lot about kind of what she planned to do when this 17-year-old child left home, that, she could go take risks. I thought this was an interesting theme and something other women spoke of too, that, if she hadn't had children, she could have gone and lived on someone's couch or moved to this place and thought about, trying this thing. But, that kids really act as this, they add increased risk, just risk of benefit loss, but just kind of overall risk. Like, you can't just move around the same way with kids. So I just thought this was an interesting, I just have to sit here on SSI until he leaves, and then I can try to do all that. And she was not alone in that kind of sentiment of kids kind of acting as an anchor that maybe precluded them pursuing certain, economic opportunities that would, require a move or things along those lines. Skip that. So the second question is resources and accommodations that could facilitate mothers with disabilities. So as I said, this is when I really, at the end of the interview, they'd tell me their whole story. And I was like, what do you need? What do you, if you have a microphone to the Social Security Administration right now, what do you want to tell them? What are you lacking? And this idea of support came through. People talked about really there was a large lack of clarity about how the system worked. Several people didn't know about ticket to work programs or what the thresholds were. I naively at the beginning of interviews would say oh, so do you have a caseworker that's kind of been with you through the whole process? And they would just laugh in my face. So I stopped asking that question and kind of got a sense that a lot of them, after they got approved, that was the end of their contact with the Social Security Administration. And they really just they were kind of just floating along and, didn't know how much money they could make, or if they could, or if they were supposed to be doing this or that. So there's a lot of kind of lack of information. A lot of people talked about wishing they had a person that they could call, or a person that would kind of personally help them. Again, childcare support, of course, that basically all of these resources pair perfectly with what the barriers were. So the barrier of childcare obviously could be remedied by additional childcare support. Mothers expressed a lot of hesitation about using childcare and danger, and kind of the quality, and maybe if they had experiences, they were negative. And so they really talked about, it would need to be something that was subsidized, was high quality, flexibility of hours. And then also, as they're job seeking, a lot of the childcare assistance is only for women who are in have a job, whereas, children are also a barrier as you're going out there and trying to find work. So that came up as well. Skip that. And then again, this earnings threshold flexibility, and this is kind of less specific to mothers and more specific, or, more broad, I think, for individuals with disabilities with or without children. But this idea of having good days and bad days came up a lot, that, people wish they could work hard for a certain period of time where they were having a good period, and then, wouldn't be penalized for earning that money when they then, people talked about dry spells or flares, health flares, flare-ups. So that was a really common theme in the supports that people were seeking or mothers were hoping for. And then again, this support for education. So this would just kind of help tip the scales as far as the labor market prospects, and the more education they have, the more, if they stand to make more money from paid work, then they might, it might be what convinces them to, take the risk of losing benefits, or, be able to pursue childcare for their children so that they could feel comfortable going into the labor market. With, a little bit higher earning potential. Okay, so as far as recommendations to the Social Security Administration, I think, first and foremost, it's acknowledge that there is a difference between women who have children and women who don't, who are in disability beneficiaries. This quote from Deja again: all of our decisions are based on our child. Every decision you make, you're not thinking about yourself, you're thinking about your kids. Every decision I'm making, I'm thinking about my son, and the Social Security needs to understand that. They specifically talked about having caseworkers that understood that they had children, and, as they're even job training programs that are, taking into account a school schedule or what the childcare situation is, just acknowledging that, caretaking is a barrier that exists for a lot of these women. I don't want to go into this too much, but this idea of the labor force participation, I think there's, in conversation with Dr. Amarin's findings about mothers with a disability being more likely to be in the labor force, as I kind of dug into this data, I found, well, a lot of these women might say they're looking for work, but it never came up in our conversation that they were actually doing anything to, any job seeking behaviors. And then also a lot of them might say that they're not in the labor market, but they're earning wages under the table. So it kind of gives a false sense that, these women are somehow surviving on the benefit when in fact, like it's being subsidized in lots of, other ways that they might just not feel comfortable sharing. So as far as who the system is working for, really the only couple women I spoke to that seemed to be doing kind of okay were those that had financial resources. They had a high earning power when they were injured, and so now collect a decent benefit. These are kind of just ways that people were able to keep their heads above water, and then also outside support. So the majority of the women don't fall into this category that I spoke to. They don't have these kind of extra financial resources or, overwhelming outside support. So for those women, they're really struggling. Implications, the presence of children is salient, not to all women. For some women, the presence of children, especially if their children were older, it was more about their disability. It was more about, just their overall labor market ability. But for some women, the presence of children, particularly young children, is, a factor that they're considering as they make employment decisions. And so that would be something that the Social Security Administration should take into account, that they have unique barriers to securing employment and then to maintaining it. A lot of women had jobs at times, and something happens with their kids and they have to, call in 3 times and they get fired, so that they're unique. They have unique needs. And then also these challenges spill over to their children, especially living in poverty, of course, is going to impact children. And they're very acutely aware of that. And then again, surveying women about labor force participation is obscuring the structural challenges that they face when they're actually pursuing and securing paid work, alongside what the boundaries of, the challenges of being a care provider. I'm really over, sorry. Limitations, future research. So this is convenient sampling. I definitely did not reach saturation. I think a lot more interviews of more targeted populations could be really useful to this. I didn't do in-person interviews. I only found a few women who had successfully rehabilitated back to work. And in those cases, it wasn't because they had gotten better. They just were kicked off. And then obviously the COVID related challenges of conducting research in this last year are kind of areas for future research. And I hope other people will, this is a very exploratory study, kind of scratching the surface, that I think could be examined in greater depth with a broader population. But that is the end of my presentation. Sorry, I had to skip a few slides. But yeah, I think this is the idea. You can't ever be empty-handed as a mother. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So questions for Sarah?
It's not really a question, but just a comment that I thought that point you made was really interesting about people, doing work under the table, so to speak, and things like that. And sort of it almost seemed like there was maybe some shame or I don't know, all sorts of sort of secrecy, and just how it's not necessarily an accurate portrayal if someone is actually being able to get by on what they're receiving because they don't feel like they can disclose what they are doing to get by. So not really a question, just thought that was really interesting, and thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it took a little bit of, to establish the trust to get them to kind of be honest about what the picture was. I think there was different levels of, kind of just trust of I had to really try to clarify that I was not the Social Security Administration myself, that I was really kind of coming at it from an angle of I know that this is more complicated. So I think for a lot of the women, I was able to get them to break down a little bit and be more honest, but I can understand why they wouldn't be that way to a caseworker or to, somebody that felt within the system and capable of, taking their benefits from them.
Sarah, it looks like we have a couple of questions for you in the chat here. So read them aloud for those who aren't on just calling in over the phone. So our first question is from Catalina. She asks, how does your conceptual framework inform the ways you define motherhood and social welfare? And go ahead.
Sorry, no, I'm just looking at that now. Themes.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So as far as how I define motherhood, I let that basically be broadly defined. I didn't specify step parents. I just said, if you have a child, if you consider yourself a mother, 50%, as long as they're with you 50% of the time, I wanted, people who are with kids. But as far as defining social welfare, I basically, I took kind of a life course approach where they were just telling me about their experience and what they're I'd kind of say like, what were challenges you faced, or can you think of a time when, living on this benefit was easier or harder, some kind of specific challenges. So as far as social welfare, I didn't have them, rate per se, how they like on any kind of scale. It was more just the sense of, people telling, the stories were pretty much full of struggle. Like that's what they talked about, is getting kicked out of this place and that they had to move here, that their mom was with them. And, then she lost her housing. And so it's kind of just picking those themes up of, to kind of get an idea of how they would define their social welfare. Trauma-informed approaches you used when communicating and interviewing the participants. That's a good question. I actually was not prepared for the level of trauma, to be honest. I entered it in probably a too naive of a way. And so after my second interview, I actually reached out to a friend who's a lawyer that does a lot of court interviews. And so she gave me some research, kind of some tips and kind of background information about trauma-informed interviewing. And there was a lot of themes that came up that I tried to focus on this, like linking it to work and not going too much into, so much of the disability was trauma related. I think 7 of the 32 were sexual assault. Like that was where their disability came from, a sexual assault. And so I would just say, like, you can tell me your story, the story of your disability, however it feels relevant to you. I didn't push on any kind of specifics of the trauma component as much as just kind of letting them tell whatever they shared, and then just making notes of like, here's trauma. But I tried to kind of stay focused more on the specific ways that would link to, what types of work they could do, or kind of keeping it linked to this idea of, labor force participation. And I guess as far as communicating and interviewing participants, I just, I was just very clear if they see, and their interviews were very emotional, and I just tried to, every time, so like, you don't have to, we don't have to go into any of the things that you're, not comfortable with. We can, so I kind of did the best I could. And then, of course there was things I was curious about, but you can kind of tell as you interview a lot of people what they want to talk about and what they don't want to talk about. And so I guess I would say I tried to let them kind of dictate. And then of course some women like told me much more than I would have expected them to tell a stranger. And I kind of would just listen and say like, that sounds really awful, or, you commiserate to the degree that's, you can't kind of hide that entirely. But so I don't know if that answers the question. Let's see.
Sure. A few other comments, but I don't know any other questions in the chat. So I guess any other questions anyone wants to type in the chat, or you can unmute yourself as well. Sarah, I have a question for you. But have you thought about how kind of the best way to capture the needs and supports of mothers of this community? Is it more of a just a box to check off, so that like something like motherhood is thought of and included when looking at benefits, or are you thinking more kind of program-wide support that would be more beneficial?
I think the first step is to collect that data on the large scale of just, because then we can run, some quantitative analysis of like, how are these, what are their labor market behaviors? How do they differ if they have, children or not? But I think, a lot of the women I think maybe just in the training of, whoever the people facing, the people who work for the Social Security Administration who are working with individuals, like having some training that these women differ in this way. So, obviously some caseworkers are going to find out that people have children, they're bringing them to appointments or whatever, but having maybe a more systematic, set of work paths that we're talking to them about, or like the childcare assistants, like kind of having, a lot of women talked about, I wish there was just kind of a clearinghouse for like that parents could go to. There was like a subset of the website that was specifically for parents that would maybe indicate, different childcare opportunities. I don't know, just some resources kind of combined, tailored to those needs, I think could be, a start at least. But it just feels like at this point, there's no conversation about the presence of children. And I think so as a very, at the very broad level, starting with acknowledging that, especially with people that, with younger children, obviously it really differs as kids get older. But I think for that kind of elementary school age children, like let's have that conversation rather than kind of like pretending that they're all the same. So I don't know if that answers your.
Yeah. We have another question in the chat from Allison. She said, what types of disabilities did the mothers have?
Yeah, I do have a chart where I kind of, I asked them to kind of define in that Google kind of clearinghouse form that they filled out. They wrote out their kind of self-defined disability. And I would say it was actually probably about half and half physical versus more, I don't know. I was like sensitive about how do you label that, mental or more like psychological trauma based. So I, the survey or the flyer got shared on like a paraplegic support group in Arizona. So I ended up talking to several quadriplegic and paraplegic women that were, so those were more like accident based physical disabilities. And then it was probably pretty evenly split. And I didn't get into too much about the specific disabilities. Just because, obviously the barriers are really different, but I felt like for the purposes of this, it was more about the, kind of presence of children, but they obviously intertwine, as far as limitations with work. But I do have a chart of that in the paper with that kind of outlines all of the participants' disabilities.
And thank you everyone for those great questions. If anyone has any other questions for Sarah, you can hold on and ask it at the very end of all of our presentations. But for now, we'll move on to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Abigail Baker, who's pursuing a Master's of Science in Occupational Therapy from the University of New Hampshire. Abby?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Let me just share my screen. And some COVID housekeeping, which is that I'm at home with my dog, and so hopefully she'll be okay during the presentation. Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint? Excellent. So the title of my research is Hallowing versus Hallowing of Job Skills, the intersection of technology, disability, and work. So I would like to thank my two mentors, Dr. Vidya Sundar and Dr. Deborah Brucker, for all their support. As well as, of course, everyone from PRI and SSA for making this project possible. Okay, a little bit of background and methods. So, in recent years, in the past decade, but especially in recent years, all sorts of people have been talking about the impact technology is having on the workplace and on workers themselves. So there have been scholars, journalists, business people, lay people alike speculating on what this impact is like and what it may continue to be like. So one popular narrative has been, in terms of people with disabilities, has been that because a lot of work is becoming less physically strenuous, this might be a really good thing for people with disabilities, right? Because it might be more accessible, at least for those with physical disabilities. But it's very unclear if this hypothesis holds true for people with mental and emotional struggles. And it's also just very unclear about what industries these people may come from and sort of the nuances of this impact. So this is where my research comes in. There is very little data-driven studies on how technology is impacting the working lives of people with disabilities. So this research starts to fill the gap as an exploratory study. Okay. So I took a mixed methods approach. I started with a very brief quantitative phase and then went into an ethnographic portion with interviews and with journaling. So I used tenure data from the current population surveys displaced worker supplement to identify high-risk industries from which workers were involuntarily displaced. I tracked employment trends. One limitation to this, unfortunately, the sample sizes of workers with a disability who were displaced from one of the top industries where workers were displaced from, those sample sizes were so small, so I had to go a little bit more broad, as you'll see in subsequent slides. And then, of course, I was limited by the questions that were asked in those surveys, since it was secondary research. For the ethnographic portion, I recruited participants through Facebook, through Craigslist, through Reddit. There were three main subgroups of folks who I recruited. The first were workers with disabilities from an industry. One of the three industries I identified in the quantitative phase where many workers were being displaced. And this first group self-identified as thriving alongside technology in the workplace. The second group were workers from one of those three industries who had a disability or health condition, and they either had to be let go from their job due to their struggle with technology, or they had their hours reduced because technology replaced some of their job responsibilities. And then the third group were managers, and I tried as much as possible to get managers from one of those three industries. It wasn't always possible. Okay, so I won't go through all these research questions for time's sake, but I'll let that kind of linger on the slide while I go through some of the ways in which I conducted my analysis. So I, of course, transcribed all of the interviews. I used AI software, actually. I condensed the discussion guide questions into research questions, read through all the transcripts. I used the constant comparison method to create a list of codes. I defined the codes using an iterative process. After coding all the data, I used inductive thematic analysis to see what patterns were surfacing and what themes. And then finally, I conducted member checks and had a really high response rate. Luckily, I believe 13 folks responded, 12 agreed with all of the themes that they were representative, and then one misunderstood the question, which was fine. So of course, limitations with ethnographic research, it's a small sample size, so it's hard to generalize some of the findings. Unfortunately, of course, due to COVID, there were some limitations in place. I would have loved to have observed these folks at work. That was originally how I was conceptualizing this project. But of course, I was limited to remote interviews and to journaling as well, which was helpful for filling in some gaps. Okay. So here are some quantitative findings. And these were really just to set the stage for the larger part of my study, which was the interviews. Okay, so from 2010 to 2018, the percentage of displaced workers declined from 4.7% to 1.8%. So this might be not too surprising. In 2010, immediate aftermath of the recession, the further that we moved away from that, the numbers got a little bit better in terms of fewer displaced workers. And of course, 2020 would probably throw a huge curveball in these numbers. And so that's just a huge caveat there. Okay. So I found that the top three industries from which workers were, that should say, involuntarily displaced were manufacturing, construction, and retail and trade. So manufacturing, many speculate that this is because a lot of manufacturing jobs are going overseas. Construction, there is certainly some automation that is moving into that industry, and retail and trade, a lot of that is moving online. And this is just sort of speculation. The CPS DWS survey did not speak to those specific reasons. So interestingly, the employment trends for workers with and without disabilities have followed nearly identical patterns. So of course, there are more workers with disabilities who have been displaced, but as you can see, those graph lines are fairly identical, which I found really interesting. Okay. So some qualitative findings. This is divided into various themes. Okay, so the first one is that technology is now ubiquitous in the workplace, but reactions to and knowledge of this technology really varies. So many people spoke about all the different types of technology they used, multiple pieces of technology in a given day. I defined technology in terms of how my participants defined it. And so in that case, I included software. So it wasn't just hardware like a computer. It was also software programs. So I took that sort of ethnographic lens in using the terms the way that my participants defined those terms, right? So, some folks who had been let go from their position expressed some fear about when new technology was introduced into their workplace. So that quote on the bottom left speaks to that, where this man is saying how the panic button lights up. Are they going to let me go? And his whole sort of thought process and the way his head sort of started spinning. This was a man who struggled with OCD, among other comorbidities. And there was really a vast array of experience and or knowledge in terms of technology, and some people's knowledge really came from like a early interest in technology. So there was one gentleman who worked in construction who actually built computers, interestingly, and he is the one on the top right who's saying that he started playing video games at 5 or 6. So he was very, very technologically savvy. And then that bottom quote on the right actually speaks to, it was interesting, a couple of the older workers, their reactions to technology in the workplace, they often expressed a lot less fear. They had seen technology change work in previous decades, and actually were much more even keeled when talking about how they believed that this might impact employability in jobs, which I thought was really interesting. And we'll get to that a little bit more later. Some of the policy implications here, many job seekers essentially need, basic computer skills. So for the ticket program, it would be useful to sort of emphasize that. And from my understanding, some of these services are offered remotely, which actually might serve as a really good opportunity to allow folks to sort of start practicing some of these skills. Okay. Why aren't I going? Oh, there we go. Okay. So the next theme. So this was all about training. So training really varied from workplace to workplace. And for people with disabilities, formal training was typically more effective. So this first quote in the top left, there was this whole idea that a lot of managers expressed that they were really proud to sort of be the one training an employee. So that was like, they took a lot of pride in being, as this person said, a leader, not a boss, and sort of personalizing training. So there was a lot of, there was a lot of pride and a lot of care given to training that these managers expressed. Something else that's interesting is that many managers actually viewed technical skills as much more trainable than interpersonal skills, which is something that'll come out later on as well. And so they thought, as long as someone has baseline skills, I can train them to do what they need to do for this position. But the interpersonal skills were often viewed as much more difficult and fuzzy to sort of unpack. Another thing is that so a couple workers with mental health conditions expressed some boredom around their training process. And so this kind of speaks to the difficulty of what is it like to have a mental health condition and to be working in this really technologically rich work environment. So there was boredom expressed, and there was also the sentiment that if they had had more formal training, perhaps it would have been easier to complete their job duties. So those two quotes on the right speak to that. Both of those folks had very informal training. Okay. So this next one is huge. It's really interesting. I know that this project, technically, no pun intended, is about technology, but human interaction is in the humanness of work or of anything is often seen as the foil to technology, right? So I really wanted to parse this. So again, most managers really prioritize either an applicant's or an employee's people skills. And things like openness and adaptability. And most participants, people with disabilities and managers alike, have a work history that involves a lot of interaction with other folks. And that was like the most interesting stories and the most sort of like the thing that they liked the best about work often involved other people. Furthermore, a lot of workers with disabilities expressed this kind of desire to help others, whether that was like a professional goal or something that they wanted to maintain at their current job, like being the go-to person. So I think, policy-wise here, I think if technology and automation is continued to is projected to continue to replace more and more jobs, and if people, if workers find jobs that involve human interaction more interesting, and if most managers prioritize soft skills, then I really think it's important to emphasize these interpersonal skills and the more human skills, like adaptability rather than like rote memorization, for example. There's other research that speaks to this. There's a report from Pearson and Nesta, and there's also a great book, Future Proof, that came out recently that speaks to this as well, about how humans should be emphasizing their humanness. Yeah, so another implication here is that, as many of us know, because of the pandemic, a lot of work has transitioned to be online. And so, yes, that's less physically strenuous, and there is some accessibility in that transition, but that may also prove to be difficult for, especially for workers with disabilities who really thrive off of in-person interaction and sort of learn better in that environment. So it's something to think about. Yeah, I'm going to flip to the next one for time's sake and skip some of those implications. Okay, so another major theme that came out was that a lot of these struggles with technology, again, speaking to mental health, were really made worse by communication issues and by mental health and cognitive limitations. So for 3 of 5 workers who were let go because of their difficulties with technology, they specifically mentioned interpersonal communication, and that was a part of their story about what went wrong. And a couple workers even explicitly blamed their mental illness as a major factor in getting fired. So as we all know, I think, mental health issues in terms of kind of implications here are often a comorbidity for people who have physical impairments or chronic conditions. And they often have a more complex and like a longer lasting impact. And so even though folks with physical disabilities may be aided by this transition to less physically strenuous work, mental health struggles might not fit this sort of simplistic analysis. And there was actually another SSA funded paper that spoke a bit to this. So I think it would be really important for SSA to continue to advocate for mental health at large. And then another implication here is that, as we all know, first I wrote this as in our post-pandemic world, but we're definitely still in the thick of it. In our pandemic world, a lot of people are really dealing with mental health struggles. And so I think it's even more important to sort of champion the importance of mental health here and how that may actually help people become gainfully employed or stay employed as well. Okay. So this last theme here is really interesting. So younger workers express a lot more judgment towards older workers in the ways in which they didn't know or were perceived not to understand technology rather than the other way around. So there was often a specific age that was stated, like if they're over 42, they must be struggling. There was a lot of impatience that was expressed about older workers. And on the other hand, a lot of older workers, and by the way, I am loosely defining older in terms of 55, 60 plus. I had a handful of folks right in their early 60s. A lot of older workers actually were much more understanding that, hey, we grew up in a different era. And so, of course, there's going to be a misunderstanding. Of course, younger folks are essentially digital natives. They didn't use that word, but they grew up with all of this, right? So when someone said coming out of the womb, they have this knowledge, and that they could tell. And someone else said that they could tell when someone was really frustrated. So that was, I thought that was interesting. So in terms of policy implications here, I think that age might be another risk factor to a certain extent, especially if someone has a mental health disorder, if someone struggles with adaptability, or maybe if they lack technology skills. It's just another risk factor compounded. And I think this might be especially important as more and more people are delaying retirement. There's a lot of older folks in the workplace. We all know that the baby boomer generation is a huge generation. Many people are not retiring yet. And so I think it's important to think about. And of course, ageism exists, and especially when we're working with technology in the workplace and the intersection of all of that. But I also think that there's a way for older workers to really draw upon their wisdom and to sort of market that as actually a really good thing rather than a negative. So, even though they might not have that immediate tech knowledge, I think that there's a lot more that they can offer, and that could be an important thing when thinking through like helping someone with an individual work plan or sort of helping with any type of job coaching. Okay. Okay. So some opportunities for further research. So I think, a huge thread, this was a very exploratory study, and I think that really honing in on mental health could be really interesting to see specifically and to just recruit folks with mental health struggles to see how they're being impacted by technology in the workplace. I think another interesting area could be studying, again, being a little bit more specific, studying certain technologies such as augmented reality, which I know is making its way into the workplace more and more. And then finally, unsurprisingly, I think COVID could be fascinating too. There's so many stories about how people's priorities are shifting in terms of how they want to spend their time, what they want to do for work, and sort of seeing how that overlaps with what people with disabilities are thinking about their trajectory in the workplace. So I wanted to use this last slide to kind of bring this out even bigger, right? So these are just some recent headlines, because I always think like, I like when research kind of connects to a larger conversation. And so from July and August, these are just some selected headlines that I found about technology and work and disability. So there's this whole concept of course, neurodiversity. And some of my participants actually spoke to this about how they were really excited to hear that some tech companies were like really trying to recruit folks who whose brains might function differently, and how that's a really cool thing. Something perhaps negative is that that bottom left headline is that there is increasingly AI is being used in hiring tools, and some folks are worried that these programs force you to disclose your disability, and then essentially it's harder to get hired. So that's kind of a red flag that some people are talking about. On that upper right, the future of work is employee well-being. I think that's something that I know it's really broad, but I think it's really important to keep in mind, especially as we're all coming out of this pandemic. And there were quite a few participants I spoke to who talked about, perhaps it was because we're in the middle of the pandemic, but how important sort of their routines were and trying to stay healthy and things like that. So I think that's it's really interesting. And then finally, COVID long haulers, are likely going to be entering into the Social Security system, and many have neurological conditions. And as the study spoke to, oftentimes those mental health and neurological cognitive limitations are what can prove to be extremely challenging when working alongside technology. Okay, I tried to speed through that. Thank you all. Are there any questions?
Thanks so much, Abby. So I have a question for you just to kick things off here. Could you just talk a little bit more? I know that you started your research kind of in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, but can you talk a little bit more about how that affected people's interactions with technology? Or did they talk about that as being a pretty prevalent piece to it? Or I know a lot of the jobs that you're mainly looking at are kind of in-person jobs, most of which people were still doing throughout the pandemic, face-to-face, but just curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so when I recruited from construction, from manufacturing, from retail trade, so a handful of those were in-person jobs, but I also, there were project managers or folks who did work remotely. So it was really a kind of a mixed bag. I think, I think the folks with mental health struggles in general, the pandemic had been affecting them even more so, which just kind of carried on into their work. Some folks were happy with the flexibility, and I don't have an exact numbers on this. I might have to look back on my report, but I think that I would say, I'm thinking of this one woman who I think she was a project manager, and she had a major accident, a physical accident, and there were some mental health issues from it, but it was primarily physically affecting her, and she was just incredibly grateful for the ability to work remotely. So again, I would have to sort of dig back in, but I think in general, there is sort of a tracking in terms of that kind of physical versus mental, and how that mental aspect can complicate things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't think anyone really anticipated the mental effect that COVID would have on so many people. So,
yeah.
Other questions for Abby? All right. Well, if you do have any other questions, feel free to hop on and ask Abby at the end of the other presentations. But for now, we'll move on to our next presenter. So our next presenter is Dr. Ariel Schwartz, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation at Boston University. So, Ariel?
Hi, thanks so much for having me and for all the support that ARDRAW has provided throughout my time working on this project. So I'm going to look at the time so I can keep on time. And now I'm excited to share about my work anticipating the outcomes, how young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities and co-occurring mental health conditions make decisions about disclosure of their mental health conditions at work. So I'm going to use a few acronyms in this presentation. IDD refers to intellectual and developmental disability, and IDDMH, intellectual/developmental disability and co-occurring mental health condition. So just wanted to put those out there at the beginning. So folks with IDD are significantly underemployed, with rates of community-based employment reported at about 20%, which is very low. And we also know that those with mental health conditions also face significant employment disparities. And so we can assume that those with both IDD and a mental health condition are really at great risk for employment disparities. And this is even more pressing with this kind of greater acknowledgement in recent years that folks with IDD have significant mental health risks, with about 1/3 of those with IDD diagnosed with a co-occurring mental health conditions such as anxiety, depression, or PTSD. So I have recently done some work with a large data set suggesting that those with IDDMH who are young have lower rates of employment, work fewer hours, and have lower hourly wages than those with intellectual disability only. So this assumption that those who have both a developmental disability and a mental health condition may be more hard hit than those with just one or the other has a little bit of support behind it. And there are significant efforts at supporting young people with IDD to maintain employment. The Social Security Administration, many educational, nonprofit, state agencies have put a lot of effort towards helping young folks with IDD get jobs, but maintaining employment is persistently a huge challenge for folks post-graduation. And so we operate under this assumption that one way that folks with IDD and those with IDD and mental health conditions are going to maintain employment is by receiving accommodations. Though in order to receive a reasonable accommodation on the job, it's required to disclose one's disability. So there's this there's this tricky issue here where disclosure is someone's individual right. And we know that you need to disclose to get an accommodation, and accommodations support job performance and tenure. So this study is kind of making this big assumption that disclosure is a positive thing. And we know that it's an ongoing decision-making process, and that those with visible disabilities are typically expected to be more likely to disclose earlier than those without visible disabilities. And some people with IDD may have more visible developmental disabilities. You can recognize a person with Down syndrome. Somebody with autism may or may not present as someone with stereotypical autism, but those who may disclose that earlier. But you don't necessarily have this with a mental health condition. And so I was really curious about how folks who may have a developmental disability with varying levels of visibility, who have probably a more likely invisible mental health condition, are making decisions around disclosing their mental health condition at work, knowing that many people with IDD are often much more impacted by their mental health condition than their developmental disability. So I had 3 objectives in this study. One was to describe the training and guidance provided to young adults with IDDMH regarding workplace disability disclosure. And the second was to describe how young adults with IDDMH make their decisions about workplace disability disclosure, specifically with regards to mental health. I also wanted to make a typology of accommodations perceived to support mental health related needs of young adults with IDDMH in the workplace. And that data is a little bit more complex, so I'm not going to present it right here. So I used an inclusive research approach in which I partnered with a team of young adults with IDDMH who had work experiences, and we met weekly or bi-weekly depending on the stage of the process. Together, we developed interview questions and a questionnaire about accommodations, and we co-conducted interviews and we analyzed the data together. We also have been working on dissemination products together, including a podcast, and they are authors on a manuscript under review. So you can see the team here. You can see us all working remotely in this COVID context. So to address objective 1, to understand the guidance provided to transition age youth, I conducted focus groups with transition specialists, employment specialists, rehabilitation counselors, those who are supporting people with IDD to attain and maintain jobs. And to understand youth's decisions around disclosure, conducted interviews with young adults. So I used thematic analysis in which I identified main ideas of each quote and organized those main ideas into categories with ongoing organization into superordinate categories of greater meaning. I'm not going to get into it too much because other people have talked about this qualitative approach, and I can answer questions later if you're curious. We use this convergent approach in which I analyze the data with a graduate research assistant separately from my analysis with the co-researcher team. And this was for logistical reasons, and also I was curious to see how our analyses might differ. What are the co-researchers with lived experiences saying that might be different from what me and a graduate student might uncover or find or interpret? And we actually found that we had very similar interpretations. So we ended up converging on the same ideas, same themes. So here's an example of some of our work on Jamboard, labeling main ideas of quotes and then organizing those main ideas into groups. So the team I worked with loved using Jamboard. So in the focus groups, I had 17 participants. On average, they'd been supporting young adults with IDD to acquire and maintain jobs for 9 years. I included, the sample included about 41% vocational specialists, 35% folks were transition specialists, and the remaining participants had other titles such as a program manager or being a job trainer. People were employed in a range of settings, including state vocational rehabilitation services, nonprofit agencies, public schools, and other agencies such as state DD services or community rehabilitation. The young adults in this study comprise a sample of about 12 people. 75% had autism, 16 to 17% had an intellectual disability, and we had a participant with cerebral palsy. Many folks had multiple mental health conditions, most common being anxiety, depression, and OCD, and some people also reported having bipolar disorder and PTSD. Overall, this group reported that they had received a range of employment supports, including job training at school and vocational rehabilitation, internships, work skills programs, and some support from a Center for Independent Living. They also reported about a third of them receiving support from a teacher, 2/3 receiving support from a job coach, and about 25% reporting other support, such as support from parents or a self-advocacy organization. So I'll start by saying that what I learned from the focus groups and the participants was very similar. There was a lot of overlap, right? I couldn't necessarily parse out if this was because young adults had been trained by these folks or not, because many of them actually had a very hard time reporting where they had gathered their ideas about disclosure from. But it was interesting that focus group participants, so professionals and young adults, really agreed on everything we had asked them about. Overall, making the decision to disclose a mental health condition is this delicate balance between one's perceived needs or needed accommodations and perceived positive versus negative outcomes. So they were really balancing, do I need something at work? Do I think there will be a good outcome with, well, how badly do I need it? And do I think there's going to be a negative outcome? So this is a qualitative study. The results are very dense, so I'm just going to highlight a few areas right now. So in terms of perceived positive outcomes, folks thought that they would receive accommodations, maybe have greater understanding in the workplace, have the opportunity to take the temperature about the workplace environment, or gain social supports. In general, folks anticipated greater positive outcomes if their employer had experience with people with disabilities. So one young adult said, I felt no shame since they work with people with disabilities. Then they'll probably be easy to work with me. And a professional shared, usually we find someone in one of our job sites that they either have a family member or they know somebody or they're familiar with the disability. We can have that person that can kind of be the go-to and understand the disability and understand what helps that individual. And some comments made about receiving accommodations and just being more well understood at work include, I was going to disclose, I figured I might look like a bad employee for certain things if I didn't mention that I had some issues. So this young adult is sharing, I kind of felt like I had to explain away some parts of myself. And once I did, then it would be a better work situation for me. Folks also spoke about taking the temperature of the workplace, so disclosing to find out if it was going to be a welcoming workplace environment. One young adult shared, do it, disclose, because you never know. The best thing, if you do it and they don't accept you, get up and leave. If they don't support you, it's not the job for you. And finally, they also talked about receiving various social supports in response to their disclosure. The negative perceived outcomes were being bullied or treated poorly or not being hired or being fired. These perceived outcomes were increased when young adults felt like there was a lot of stigma around their mental health condition. One shared, I didn't want to look like I'm a psychopath. And another shared, I just didn't think everybody should know about my disorders. They'll probably say, well, she'll get mad easily or she'll do this. People will judge you for the bipolar and depression. And so folks talked about timing of disclosure varying. They talked about having early disclosure when their mental health was relevant to their workplace performance. So if they thought, you know, my anxiety, my PTSD is really going to get in the way of work, they felt like I got to disclose early. But if they didn't, they would choose to wait to decide, well, let's wait and see. And if it becomes relevant or needs arise, then I'll disclose. They also spoke about how sometimes involvement of a job placement or job agency, a job placement agency or job coach, maybe took away this option to disclose early, late, or not at all because of the presence of professionals. One professional shared, us being there, that doesn't even give them the opportunity to choose. And another shared, I honestly felt like they knew, having a job coach, that sort of sets off red flags. Individuals shared that it was important to treat mental health as a private matter, and so they advised disclosing in a manner that was short and sweet, only talking about what was relevant and focusing on strengths and solutions. One person shared, keep it simple and keep it short. And a young adult said that they really wanted to focus on the things that mattered. They don't need to know that I have depression, but they do need to know that I have anxiety and that I have OCD, because both of those will impact my job, at least for me, more than depression would and autism. And professionals really emphasize that disclosure should be paired with what can be done to support the individual. Once you tell them that you have trouble with something, I'm like, have a solution and say, but when this problem occurs, this is what I found that helps me out. So the employer knows, okay, this is the accommodation you need right away. If we get that in place right now, we shouldn't have any issues. Both professionals and young adults thought that disclosing to bosses and supervisors was the kind of first route and the most important person to disclose to. They felt like these individuals have knowledge of accommodations, they're the people in charge, and in many cases, young adults felt like they were a trusted person. When it came to coworkers, professionals more or less said, nope, don't do it, it's a bad idea, it's going to open folks up to bullying. And young adults said it really depends. Some young adults agreed that it would lead to bullying, with one sharing, they'll just use it to pick on people with disabilities. But others spoke about how it could lead to social support, and they even talked about finding shared experiences and bringing up issues in a casual way. It would be brought up casually, like, hey, do you guys ever have issues with this? And young adults felt like it could really be a point of bonding and support. So in summary, I kind of identified the how, what, to whom, when, and when. This is a mislabeled. It's kind of these two halves. So in summary, we're really weighing these anticipated outcomes with needs. Do I really need an accommodation, and are the outcomes going to be positive or negative? And it was really important to disclose only what was relevant to work, to those in charge, and maybe to coworkers selectively. And again, thinking about relevance and outcomes, folks were really saying, I'm going to do it early if it's relevant, and I'm going to do it later if it's not relevant in the beginning but needs a rise. And there was this emphasis on keeping disclosure short, sweet, focused, and focused on strengths and solutions. So disclosure decisions are complex and ongoing, and this is congruent with tons of other research in this area, that it's not a one-time decision, and many other folks have reported in other studies that people do weigh positive and negative anticipated outcomes. Young adults here really highlighted the importance of workplace supports and the social environment, and they really talked about the importance of being in a workplace that was familiar with disability and supportive of disability, really implying that it's important for workplaces to signal inclusiveness in job advertisements and initial interactions. Also, it would be really helpful to think about focusing on centering the employee identity versus the disability identity when doing interviews or first introducing people to jobs, to kind of foster a more positive potential outcome and to focus on strengths and solutions. We also had this really interesting discussion within the data about choice and how when professionals are involved, sometimes disclosure decisions are taken out of the hands of young people, and really thinking about the timing of when professionals step in to provide support to provide young adults with more opportunities to make their own decisions about disclosure rather than having this like default, well, there's a job coach here, so there must be some sort of disability. This study included a small sample, and many of the young adults had autism. It would have been really great to have a more diverse, heterogeneous disability population. And the range of vocational services provided to young people were really broad, so it was really hard to draw conclusions about the impact of the guidance provided. So future research that I think is really relevant to thinking about what the Social Security Administration might be interested in is how employer level interventions might promote disclosure, right? We're making this accommodation that disclosure is good because we know that accommodations really, really support job tenure. So if we need people to get those accommodations, and right now that requires disclosure. So what can be done on the employer level to promote disclosure, to promote this disability friendly environment, a welcoming environment, an environment where people feel like it is safe to ask for what they need. And this could have to do with workplace advertisements or the onboarding process, or maybe having even affinity groups within a large employer so folks with disabilities can connect with each other. I'm really interested in looking at this set of data more closely and maybe conducting some additional follow-up interviews to think about how folks were talking about disclosing their mental health condition in a way that was different from disclosing their developmental disability. My initial thoughts from the data are that there's just a lot more stigma around a mental health condition, and that folks have a more positive identity associated with being autistic or having an intellectual disability. They see that as part of themselves as more than I am a person with depression. So I'm interested in delving into that data a little bit more. It would be great to learn a little bit more about what work environments support disclosure and the communication strategies that employers can adopt to support disclosure and really foster this sense of inclusivity and openness. So I'd like to thank the co-researcher team, Jesse, Alex, and Jenna, Isabel Everett for helping with the data analysis, and of course my mentor Sally Rogers, who's at Boston University, and ARDRAW and the postdoc grant from NIDLR that I have been working on. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Ariel. That was great. Questions? My question for you was going to be more about your thoughts, or if you got any feedback on how to make work environments more inclusive. But you're talking about doing that as a part of your future research. So that's to come.
Yeah, no, I don't feel like I got much from this study from that other than just people felt more comfortable if they knew that there were other people with disabilities working there, or they knew that their employer had a family member with a disability, or there was some kind of signaling of like, hey, you're not the first person with a disability we've ever met. But short of that, I don't have other answers.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. It's subjective too sometimes, so it's a difficult thing about what makes someone feel the most comfortable. So
yeah.
Other questions for Ariel?
I'll note that, Erica, that in the paper I've written up, I really focus on this theory called the communication accommodation theory, and thinking about how this theory might be really interesting to research in this context in the future, because it talks about how people with different identities and different levels of power interact with each other. And if something about like those small exchanges in an interview or onboarding could really influence someone's comfort or the type of information that's shared both from the employer and the person with the disability, and how thinking about, again, that could lead to employer level interventions to foster a more supportive kind of initial interaction to create that shared understanding of you're an employee and we want you to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that is a really interesting part of your paper, and for everyone else, that paper will be posted within the next couple of weeks, and you should definitely check it out. So we'll move on to our last presenter here, but Ariel will stay on board if there's any questions at the end. But for now, we'll move on. Our last but not least presenter will be Meghan Donahue. Meghan is a PhD candidate in the Industrial and Systems Engineering program, the Human Factors Department at the University at Buffalo. So Meghan.
Unmute, start video. Need a second here. Okay, I believe you are seeing my presentation screen. Hope so.
Yes.
And ready to get going here. I hope everybody has a second to stretch or two, and feel free to move around while listening to me talk. I guess you can do that in the privacy of off camera, but it's a good thing to remind you in case you forgot to do it, because I do sometimes. So anyways, more consumers leave the VR program unemployed than do with employment. This is true for the VR program as a whole. And my screen's goofy here. There we go. There we go. Now I can see everything. So this is true for the VR population as a whole. Applicants with SSI, SSDI, concurrent support. Only those who entered the VocRehab system without SSA supports had a higher likelihood of employment exit. This is the most surprising outcome of my research and acts as a huge arrow pointing to where future research needs to go. My name is Meghan Donahue, and as Erica said, I'm an industrial engineering PhD candidate in the specialties of human factors and rehabilitation engineering. I'll be taking the next 25 minutes to explain to you how I arrived at this major take-home point by explaining who the VR consumer is, what they do in VR, how they end up, and then how we can use that to predict future employment achievement with other consumers. So for those of you who may not be familiar with VR or vocational rehabilitation, it's a joint federal and state program that people with disabilities access in order to gain, maintain, or improve employment because their disability is currently interfering with their opportunities. To participate, they must apply and then be determined eligible. Once they're in the program, they work with a VocRehab counselor. They develop an individualized plan for employment called their IPE, which includes their employment goals, the services needed to achieve that goal, who's going to provide those services, how they're going to evaluate progress towards the goal, and then the responsibilities of both the consumer and the VocRehab counselor. Then once their goal has been met and they've maintained that employment for 90 days, and that employment has to be in line with the goal, then their case is closed. However, they can always reapply if their needs change in the future. There's 31 services that can be received by the consumer, and those can be provided by VR. They could be purchased from an outside agency, or another organization may provide a comparable service. So yeah, we could provide this training, but you're getting that through a program at your college kind of thing. There's 3 categories that the services fall under. There's training services, career services, and other services. I'll explain all of these a little bit more detail shortly, but as time's limited, I don't want to go through all of the previous research completed in this area. The important thing to know is that previous research has considered the outcomes in VR by looking through a more limited lens of specific impairments or impairment groups or specific geographic regions. As far as I'm aware, I'm the first person to consider the entire VR population as a whole, regardless of their impairment, and for the entire country. My data set is publicly available. The Rehabilitation Services Administration tracks the outcomes, demographic information, and benchmarks for all people who applied to the public program. Although there are private voc rehab companies, they are not tracked in this data set. So at 1.34 million cases were closed in the program years 2017 and 18, meaning that their cases closed between July 1st, 2017 and June 30th, 2019, probably between 8 a.m. on the one day and 5 p.m. on the other day. I'm primarily interested in adults, especially because there's already a research effort in place for youth with SSI. So I removed everybody under 26 from my population. And then I also removed anybody that was in secondary school at the time of application, because there are a couple states that have special programs where you can be older and in secondary school. This left me with 457,251 individuals to work with. And I split them into 4 different groups of possible SSA support. Most of them did not receive any, that's 64%. 19% received SSDI, 14% received SSI, and then concurrent support, meaning both SSI and SSDI, is received by 4%. And so those are mutually exclusive groups. How will we describe the VR consumer demographically? Well, first we need to recognize that generally speaking, the ratios of males to females is similar to that in the US labor force, with about 6% more males than females. However, in VR, there's twice as many Black people than there are in the labor force, and there are also slightly more American Indians and Indigenous peoples. A smaller proportion of white people go through VR than are in the labor force, and to a slightly lesser degree, this is the same with Asian people. There's only one ethnicity category in my data set, Hispanic, and less people in the VR population identify as Hispanic than in the labor force. Overall, lower education is common in the VR population. About half of the population has a high school diploma, GED, or certificate of completion of their IEP. Almost a fifth of the population did not complete high school or any of those equivalents. Higher education degrees and certificates are only attained by about another fifth of the population. As education credentials limit work opportunities, if we include the people that started college but didn't get that piece of paper yet, more than 3/4 of the VR population are limited by having a high school diploma, its equivalent, or less. And about 3/4 of the population are unemployed when they developed their most recent version of their IPE. Unfortunately, we don't know the rest of their past employment history with this data set, but still, if our starting point is unemployed, that we have to look at how different things happen. So other research has found with specific disabilities that the VR approach is different when somebody is employed versus not employed at the start of the program. And we also know that the odds of achieving employment tend to be higher for those who are employed at application than a lot of the previous research through those limited lenses. There's also 26 employment barriers, and the first one is being unemployed for 26 consecutive weeks or 6 months. Other ones include being within 2 years of exhausting the limits of their temporary assistance for needy families, or being a foster care youth or someone who's aged out of the foster care system. You could be homeless, ex-offenders, low-income households, limited English language skills, there's low literacy, computation abilities, cultural barriers, single parents, displaced homemakers, migrant workers. All these are different types of employment barriers. Almost a third of the population doesn't have any employment barriers, and most people only have a couple to a few of the 26 barriers that are listed in the data set. As this can indicate some of the challenges that have to be overcome, I anticipated seeing more barriers. Of course, disability-related challenges such as transportation difficulties, communication difficulties, impairment severity, they aren't part of this category of data. And then we have invisible disabilities in the brain, including psychosocial, cognitive, and other mental impairments, are the primary impairment for more than half of the people that go through VR. Although it's common for somebody to have multiple impairments, the primary disability in this data set is the primary impairment that's affecting your employment. So only one box gets checked for each person. So all of the data shown is related to the applicants. Not everyone will actually go through VR, which we'll talk about later, but it really stands out that more than half of the population has those invisible disabilities, and then it's small proportions for the rest of those disabilities. So I've given you a brief sketch of the demographics for the whole VR population, but what about the 4 subgroups and how are they different? Well, with SSI, we have more people who haven't completed high school education or its equivalent. And we also have more people that have their IEP certificate of completion through high school. This may be related to the fact that almost double the proportion of supported employment goals fall in this SSI group than with the VR population. And supported employment is competitive employment with support such as like a job coach. So overall, this equates to a less educated group than the whole VR population. And almost 10% more of these SSI applicants are unemployed. And we also have more significant disabilities than with the whole VR population. And when we compare them to the other SSA groups of all the different fundings, SSI has the greatest percent of Black people and the smallest proportion of white consumers. For SSDI applicants, they are least likely to have a cognitive impairment. They're also slightly more likely to be employed at application than the SSI applicants were. Compared to the VR population as a whole, their race distribution matches up in alignment, but they're slightly more educated. And most of this comes because across all the different SSA groups, all 4 of them, they have the smallest likelihood of not completing high school or the equivalent. There's also a higher prevalence of physical impairments in this group compared to the VR population. Nearly everybody has a significant or most significant disability, which makes sense because of eligibility criteria for SSDI. And then for a concurrent group, even though there are more males than females in the labor force, the VR population as a whole and most of the SSA groups, it's a 50-50 split in the concurrent supports group. So compared to the other SSA groups, we also have a greater proportion of people who are unemployed at application. They have the highest likelihood of having a supported employment goal, with a little less than a third of them having that at their IPE. They also have the greatest proportion of psychosocial impairments and the lowest likelihood of having hearing loss. When we compare the concurrent support applicants to the whole VR population, we again have more Black people and less white people, which is already tipped from the labor force. And then these diversions from the population aren't as extreme as they were in that SSI group distribution. We also have a higher proportion of poorly educated people for the job market, although it's not quite as high and extreme as that SSI group had. Similar to the SSI group, we have a greater proportion of IEP certificates of completion than the rest of the groups and as the VR population as a whole. Our group that isn't receiving any SSA support has the highest employment rate at their IPE, which is also higher than the whole population. When we compare them with the entire VR population, they have a higher representation of white people and a lower representation of Black people, but that's not enough to make it proportionate to the distribution in the US labor force. Education levels align closely with the population, and cognitive impairments are lower than the VR population as a whole, but also lower than all three of the other SSA groups. And then hearing loss is much higher than the VR population and the other three SSA groups. And then there's an even split between significant and most significant disabilities, and then about 12% people have a not significant disability at all. So what happens to all these people when they go through VR? Well, the meat of VR are the services that they coordinate and provide for the consumer. The fact that 12% or 3 out of every 25 people, or really anybody that goes through the program receives no services is like alarm bells to me. For people with multiple sclerosis and cerebral palsy, we know that competitive integrated employment odds are increased with the receipt of more services. Still, more than half the population is receiving 0 to 3 services. And this pattern holds regardless of what type of SSA support is received. When we start breaking it down to what types of services and looking at the career services, VR counseling was the most common, being received by a little less than half of the population. This is fairly evenly received with all SSA groups. Only a few less with concurrent support receive them. Assessments were also pretty common, being received by a little more than a quarter of the population, and again, nearly equally received across all the groups. The next 3 most common career services are job placement assistance, diagnosis and treatment of impairments, and job search assistance. And they're all fairly rare, happening in similar proportion to the 3 and 25 people who received no services. And all this is pretty disappointing. Research indicates, again, that the more services increase your odds of employment, but no matter how we cut this, not a lot of people are getting these services. I want to also note benefits counseling is received more by SSA beneficiaries, but again, only in a very small percentage. Benefits counseling is a service that helps a person learn how to balance their benefits and work. So how much can you work and earn and keep your SSA benefits? How much can you work and earn and keep your SSA health benefits? What would you do to be able to have your work benefits exceed what you're getting through SSA? Would pass be a possibility to work within your employment goals and strategies? So then when we look at our other services, we have transportation, maintenance, and other services as the catch-all category, and rehab technology are the most popular ones. Again, they're received by very few consumers. Transportation is similar to the amount of people that are receiving no services, and the other 3 are received by less than 1 in 10. 4 other services exist, but these are received by less than 1 in every 100 people. And then training services are the least popular of those 3 categories. Job readiness training is the most common, and about 1 in every 25 people receive it. So what difference does it all make? Well, the good news is that the rate of competitively employed people does increase a little bit, from 10% for those with no SSA support to 16% for those with SSDI. Using descriptive analysis, we don't know if this is significant, but it's heartening. What's CIE? So CIE is competitive integrated employment. It's employment in an environment that is with people without disabilities. That's the integrated, there's no segregation. And it's at a competitive wage compared to the people without disabilities. Even knowing that, when we go back to our opening comments, still more people are exiting without employment than with CIE. The only group where more people exit with CIE than unemployed are those with no SSA support. We also have a large proportion of people that are exiting after eligibility, but before they enter the program. This amounts to 2/3 of the people that achieve CIE. Just for proportion matching, 2/3 of the people that achieve CIE, that amount of people are exiting and never even do the program. And so That's another huge warning bell to me. But the changes in specific public supports are really small. So we have about a 1% drop in SSI receipt, a 2% increase in SSDI, and no change in concurrent support. With 450,000 people, these changes are like microscopic. Tiny proportions of people are dropping their benefits, and similarly tiny proportions of people are adding their benefits. So I've given you a rough picture of the VR population, the services they received, and how this changes through going through the program. But and then we also have rough sketches of the differences of the SSA benefits application, but how does it fit together, and how is it meaningful, and how is it significant? So I took that data, the 457,000 people, and I treated it and excluded all those people that exited pre-programmed, pre-eligible, and ineligible from that data set. And that cut it down to 330,000 cases about. And then I used all the demographic variables and personal characteristics we've discussed, and a few more that I didn't have time to discuss as covariates, and developed 4 different logistic regression models to predict CIE achievement, yes or no, considering the 14 VR services that were received by more than 2% of the population. So that gives me a model for predictive employment for each of my 4 SSA groups that we've been discussing. The first thing that I noticed is that the receipt of 6 services increased the odds of employment regardless of which group we're looking at. Their short-term job supports, rehab technology, maintenance services, miscellaneous training, supported employment services, and job placement assistance. Now, the odds ratios are shown in the table. A person with SSI at application who receives miscellaneous training is 2.7 times more likely to achieve CIE than someone who doesn't receive that training and has SSI. A person with SSDI who receives rehab technology is 2.3 times more likely to achieve CIE than a person with SSDI who doesn't receive it. Recall, short-term job supports and supported employment services were on that rarely provided list. I'm thinking like 4%, 2% of the population kind of thing. Job readiness training, other services, and information and referral increase the odds of employment for SSI, SSDI, and no support groups, and no SSA support groups. And we know benefits counseling is a protective factor for SSI and SSDI recipients. Diagnosis and treatment of impairments and VR counseling, those 2 most popular services, or up there with the most popular services, are only protective factors for people without SSA support. And the only service that is a significant risk factor is assessments for people with concurrent support or no SSA support. I mentioned that about 12% of the people receive no VR services regardless of a SSA receipt. It was the same for all 4 of those subgroups. So compared to that, receiving 1 service increases the odds of employment for SSI recipients and decreases the odds for people without SSA support. Otherwise, incredibly unpopular number of services, like less than 4% of the overall population receives 7 or more services, indicates that a lot of services reduces the odds of achieving employment for most groups. This could be confounding, though, by another factor associated with the receipt of a lot of services, such as complexity of the case. And the rest of the number of services where the majority of people fall is actually insignificant. So 1 service for SSI recipients is slightly protected, but for most people, the number of services actually has little bearing on employment achievement. I also found it interesting that there were some demographic and personal characteristics that could have an impact. For example, receipt of unemployment insurance is a protective factor for SSDI and no SSA support applicants. And they have a lot of different types of insurance. Like if you have many types of insurance, that's also protective. Being female is a mild risk factor for everyone except SSDI recipients, which could simply be related to the fact that SSDI recipients have prior work experience that varies compared to the other groups. Being an American Indian or Indigenous person is also a risk factor. But I can poke a lot of holes in the value of these significant relationships. For example, receipt of 1 or 2 public supports at application is also a risk factor for no Social Security support app recipients. But it isn't significant for the other 3 groups. Well, is that because I already controlled for that by defining my populations? And so those other 3 groups already have at least 1 public support based on the definition of them. Further, when we look at disability, we find that compared to having no impairment, the type of disability is not a predictive factor for employment achievement if you have SSDI. We also find that disability has some effect on employment. Sometimes it's protective, more often it's a risk for people with no SSA support compared to having no employment. But we can't compare the effect of disability in the SSI and concurrent groups because they're measured against blindness instead of no impairment, because there's nobody in those groups that has no impairment. And then comparing against blindness doesn't give a VR counselor any practical information who might use this to figure out what types of services need to be going on with the person with different types of disabilities and how to treat that. So that leads to the greatest limitation of the research. The complexity of the system with all the different variables makes it challenging to create a robust regression model. It's recommended that future research employ alternate modeling methods that are more robust to improve my predictions and understanding of the significant relationships. With the high proportion of people that exit unemployed or pre-programmed, we also need to conduct research that investigates these 2 groups. We could develop different models that are actually trying to predict the failure to achieve employment and looking at those significant factors, and then we look at the ones that are significant in achieving employment, we can get a much stronger picture of those 2 extremes. In the meantime, VR counselors should recognize that SSA support at application does indicate different services that should be received and that their consumers should be treated differently. I'd like to give a special thanks to ARDRAW and PRI for their mentorship, guidance, and funding for this work. And then I also second thank you to my advisor, Dr. Victor Paquette, for his time and effort mentoring me through this ocean of data. And then as a question that I have for you, because I've thrown a lot of statistics at it and not any qualitative information, I wonder what you found most interesting in this project.
So thanks so much, Megan. Thoughts on the question or questions for Megan?
Searching for the Zoom window. There we are.
Was that a question someone had? Yeah. Well, Megan, we've got a note here in the chat box from Ariel, so we'll start there first. She said, she found your analysis of the outcomes associated with supports really interesting.
Yeah, I thought splitting that into those 4 groups really helps create a clearer picture. And I'm doing it for a few different ways of doing groups as a bigger part of one of the papers that I'm working on. But every time you get into it and start adding in those different levels of analysis, it just gets more and more fascinating.
I'll share that I also thought the number of supports that someone's received, just the effect that has on the stats, I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, just very interesting. Did you get any, when you were doing a lit review, did you get any ideas for, why some supports systems may not see as much involvement as others, or just why there's a lack of people engaging in support in general?
I mean, like why we're seeing such a low percentage for each of those services?
Yeah.
Not a lot of indications. I mean, some of the previous literature suggests assessment, which was one of the more likely to be a risk factor service. is something that you tend to give somebody when you don't know what to do. So maybe a vocational evaluation where you're trying to even figure out what their aptitudes are and what jobs might be a good fit. That would be something that would probably fall under that assessment category. And so it might be, and this is something that needs to get teased out over future years of work, is understanding what's going on between the prescription of any of those services. And is it really that it's the assessment that is that, or is it just tends to be very, very complex consumers that are receiving those assessments, and figuring out how to filter out all of those confounding factors. So I'm going to try in the next phase of my dissertation doing some causal modeling, which will include a lot more rigorous assumptions related to the statistical models. And hopefully I'll also employ a lot of matching approaches to mimic randomized controlled studies to help tease out some of that. But again, in the scope of a dissertation, you're very limited. I mean, this could be decades of doing those models before you really have a clear picture of it. There's just so much to learn.
A lot of data here, and you handled it well. So,
yeah.
Any other questions for Meghan? Well, if there are no other questions for Meghan, do we have any questions for any of our other presenters who are on? I will just very quickly here do a plug for our, tomorrow we'll have our last webinar in our webinar series. So I just want to thank all of you for coming today. Thank you so much to our presenters. You all did a wonderful job. And I would encourage you all to attend our webinar tomorrow as well. If you have any questions about the ARDRAW program, feel free to hop on the website, or you can reach me at ardraw@prainc.com. So thank you so much, everyone.